And the song before our lesson will be 576. That was 576. If it's not a burden to you, please stand. Do, mi. Please be seated.
Good morning. Please turn your Bibles to Exodus chapter 4, and I'll be reading verses 10 through 17. That was Exodus chapter 4, verses 10 through 17. It reads, "Then Moses said to the Lord, 'Please, Lord, I have never been equivalent, neither recently nor time past, since you have spoken to your servant. For I am slow to speech and slow to tongue. But the Lord said to him, 'Who has been made a human mouth, or what makes anyone unable to speak, or deaf, or able to see, or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now then go, and I instruct you in what you are to say.' But he said, 'Please, Lord, now send your message by whomever you will.' Then the anger of the Lord burned against Moses, and he said, 'Is it there not your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he speaks fluently, and moreover, behold, he is coming out to meet you. When he sees you, he will be overjoyed. So you are to speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I myself will be with your mouth and his mouth, and I will instruct you into what you are to do. He shall speak for you to the people, and he will be as a mouth for you, and will be as a God, and I will be as a God to him. And you shall take your hand in your staff, which I have performed the signs.'"
Good morning, good morning. What a wonderful day the Lord hath made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. This morning is going to be the last sermon in this series that we've been going through of the excuses that Moses gives here. And this one right here, again, it is one that hits close to home. Because he's saying, I'm incompetent. I'm inadequate. I'm not enough, Lord. Now, I don't know if you've heard about this phrase. This is a new phrase that I learned from my wife. Yes, I learned things from my wife. It's a great thing. Husbands should try it from time to time. But nevertheless, she taught me a term, and it was called weaponized incompetence. Have you ever heard of this term before? This term is essentially the idea that you're so incompetent at something that you can get out of something and make somebody else do that something, right? It's pretty clever, actually. And I was like, this is pretty ingenious, whoever came up with this. But apparently, you can feign incompetence at doing the dishes, and then they will magically get done by somebody else, right? You can be so bad at loading the dishwasher that somebody else will come along and do it. You can be so bad at folding laundry that somebody else will come along and do it. But are you really that bad at it? Or are you just feigning this incompetence so that somebody else actually comes and does it for you, even though you were completely capable of doing so? You see, it's rather childish to do it whenever you really think about it, because this is what my children do all the time. You see Wyatt here this morning? He has a button-up shirt on today. He has a vest on today. Guess who did all of his buttons? That little guy right there. That's some little fine motor skills, if you ask me. He can do all that. But guess what he can't do? He can't retuck in his blanket onto his bed in the middle of the night. So then he has to come to me and do that, that little kid stare. He doesn't say a word to you. He just stands at the side of the bed and looks at you until you wake up suddenly, right? So that then you go back and then you tuck in the blanket for him because he obviously is too incompetent to do it himself. The same thing with cutting up chicken nuggets, the same thing with chewing, and we could, go down the list of things. But it's weaponized incompetence. How often do we do the same thing to our Heavenly Father, though? To where we say, God, I'm not good enough. God, I'm incompetent. God, I'm not enough. Somebody else should do it. You see, this is at the root of it what Moses is getting at here. He says, God, I'm not enough. And if we track back through the various excuses of Moses here, we can see several of his excuses. We can see his excuse of identity here. He says, God, who am I to go and be the Redeemer of Israel? Next, he'll move to being ill-equipped. Well, there we go. Ill-equipped, and the next, the inevitability of his failure. And then finally, he goes to, I'm inadequate. And this is the fourth one that I want to look at here. And I had originally broke this up into 5, but I'm going to tie the last one into this one right here as well. But he says, God, I'm not eloquent. If we look here in Exodus chapter 4, I invite you to open your Bibles over there. Exodus chapter 4, starting in verse 10 here, we find this excuse really coming to bear. He says here, but Moses said to the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue. This right here, he says, God, I know that you're calling me to do this, but behold, guess what? I'm not that good of a speaker. I'm not that eloquent, which means to be able to fashion words together in a pleasing sense, in an understandable way. I'm not that guy that you're asking for. And then he says, I'm slow of tongue. Now, theologians have debated time in and time again of what exactly this means. Some will conclude, well, that means that Moses had a stutter. That means that he stumbled over his words. That meant that he began to stammer or that he got tongue-tied whenever he was going through it. And whether you're on the boat of stuttering, stammering, or stumbling over words, it doesn't matter. What matters is that Moses believes that he's incompetent for the job that God has tasked to him. That's truly what matters. It doesn't matter what really was going on here, because we could debate about that all day long. But nevertheless, what Moses is saying here is that, God, I know that you have me and would have me to do this thing right here, but Lord, I'm going to tell you something that you don't know. Lord, I'm going to tell you something that you perhaps have not put into the equation for the salvation of your people. He says, I'm not the guy. I'm not a spokesperson. And the fear of public speaking is something I can sympathize with because I'm terrified of it. That's the honest truth. I'm terrified of getting up in public speaking. You know, I can hardly eat the day before, I hardly sleep the night of, and here this morning my stomach's in knots. I don't want to do this. But nevertheless, what do? We do what God has called us to do. And that's the same thing with each and every one of us. It's very interesting that the fear of public speaking, if you look it up nowadays, what is the number one fear in America? Guess what? Number one used to be death. But guess what took it now? It's the fear of public speaking. People, in essence, would rather die than get up and public speak. So therefore, I hope none of us have to speak at our own funeral, because that's a double hit there. But we can kind of sympathize with Moses here to say, I don't want to do what God has called me to do. And we can sympathize this within the church, that God has called us to be zealous for good works. God has called us to be able to work in His vineyard. If we look there to Titus chapter 2, and in verse 14, we can look to Ephesians chapter 2 as well, that He who began a good work in us will bring it to completion in the day of Jesus Christ. There in Philippians chapter 2, that He has prepared for us before the foundations of the world good works. God has prepared for us to be able to do things. And we'll begin to give these excuses to say, I'm inadequate for what God has called me to do. And I'm inadequate to evangelize. I'm inadequate to preach. I'm inadequate to teach. I'm inadequate to keep your statutes. And we could go down the list here because each and every one of us are going to feel inadequate in differing ways. Because what I might be strong in, you might be weak in. And what you might be strong in, I might be weak in. But nevertheless, that does not give us a pass from the call of God. That does not give us a pass to be able to excuse ourselves from service to God. You see here, he says, I am not the man, because I'm not eloquent. And really, this excuse that he gives here is an excuse that all of us try to use from time to time. Perhaps not the eloquent manner, but because it is the truth, we try to use it. You see, one of the biggest things that tends to hinder us in our service to God is truth. The truth of my inadequacy. The truth of my insufficiency. The truth of my frailty. And then I try to take that and say, God, see, that's why I can't do this. And all those things are true, too, of why I can't do this. But then we forget that the God that we're serving is the truth. And that He has called us to be able to deliver His truth. So it doesn't matter what the truth is regarding my ability or my inability, God has called me. So then we answer the call. You see this excuse here? It was tried by the prophet Jeremiah. If we look there to Jeremiah chapter 1, if you look there in verse 5, in verse 4 and 5, the call of the Lord, it comes unto Jeremiah, and God says, I have prepared for you, and I have chosen you since your mother's womb to go out and to be a prophet to the nation. But then he says, but, O Lord, I do not know how to speak, for I am but a youth. He says, God, I can't get up here and be a prophet unto the nation because I can't speak. I'm just a youth. And both of those things, guess what, probably were true. Both of those things right there were probably realities in Jeremiah's life. But then God, in His sovereignty and in His power, fully equipped him. Because if you read the verses immediately after that, God says, do not fear, for I will be with you. He gives him the promise of presence. The same thing that He gave to Moses there whenever he was struggling with his identity. He says, and I will be with you. The same promise that was given to us there in Matthew chapter 28, verses 19 through 20. For I will never leave you nor forsake you. The promise of presence. And then He says, and I will be with your mouth, or I'll be with what you say. I will teach you. Therefore we need not fear. The same thing that Moses was fearing here whenever he says, for they will not believe me. I'm ill-equipped for the task at hand. And then God says, and say this unto them. He gives them exactly what He is to say. He felt inadequate. Another person that perhaps does not fall into complete congruency with the call that was given and with the ability that he was given is perhaps the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul really shows this incongruency with God's demands and then his own detriments. For Paul, by all accounts, he was not a mighty speaker. By all accounts, he was not an eloquent man. We can look there in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. He makes this abundantly clear to us whenever he says, "For I did not come to you with persuasive speech or the wisdom of man, for I sought to know nothing among you except for Christ and Him crucified." He said, I didn't come with these ostentatious words. I did not come to you in loftiness of speech. In fact, the other apostles and many of the early first century Christians would account his speech as being as nothing. Right? If we look there in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and in verse 10, it says that very fact to us, to where it says his letters are heavy and weighty. They're powerful, the letters of Paul. But his bodily presence, it's nothing. And his speech, it's nothing. Meaning that whenever he got up and he was trying to be an orator, he was terrible. That whenever he was there in person, he was not imposing. He was nothing to be looked at. But God was still able to use him to be able to preach the Word of God through many nations, to be that apostle unto the Gentiles, and to be able to write the majority of the New Testament that we have here today. Paul was able to overcome his inadequacies. You see, we need to begin to leave the fleeting excuses and begin faithful expedition. We need to begin to take that step of faith outside of the boat, because that's what God has called us to do. Far too often do we say, I am not this and I am not that, that we fail to remember that the one that we're serving is the great I am. So it does not matter what I am not, as long as I'm serving the great I am. Because He will provide for us that which we need. He will be the sufficiency in our insufficiency. He will give unto us all that we need. The question is, do we trust that? Do we trust that enough to be able to step out of the boat? Do we trust that enough to be able to go out into the community? Do we trust that enough to be able to talk to our friends and family? Don't give this excuse of inadequacy. You see, this is his resistance to the call of God. He's resisting God, saying, I'm not enough. And so many, even those outside of the church, will use this resistance as well. And perhaps it begins to manifest itself in a little bit of a different way, to where they will resist the call of God here in essence of saying, I'm not good enough. Of saying, God, I don't have enough ducks in a row yet for me to be able to come into your house. For me to be able to be baptized into your Son. For me to be able to dedicate my life to you. Say, God, I'm inadequate. But again, none of us are. And that's really what I want to try to give to you here this morning. There was only one perfect man. And that is the man, Jesus Christ. That is the perfect, sinless, blemishless Son of God. That's it. Everybody else is flawed. Everybody else has struggles. Everybody else has a chink in their armor. But then God can still use each and every one of us. Because if you get nothing else from this sermon, get this right here. Whenever God has called you, it is not so that you may display your power, but so that He may display His power through you. That is the essence of this. Because I'm not seeking my glory, but I'm seeking to glorify the Father who is in heaven. That is the same thing that we read there in Matthew chapter 5, whenever it tells us that we are to do good works so that then the people or the nations may see your good works and give glory to your Father who art in heaven. That's the purpose here. So do it. This resistance to God here, I want you to notice how God responds to this. God, He responds to this, and then the Lord said unto him, Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute, or deaf, or seeing, or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now, therefore, go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak. This right here, notice the emphatic nature that God uses here. He says, Is it not I, the Lord? The Lord. Because notice what Moses gave to him immediately before in that excuse. He says, "Oh what? Oh Lord." In the Hebrew word here, it's Adonai. The Greek equivalent to this is kurios. It means master, king, sovereign, the one who is in control of all things. But Moses here is saying, "Lord, Lord," but he's not doing what he is to say. You see, he's calling him Lord, but he's not listening. He's calling him master, but he's not minding. He's calling him sovereign, but he's not serving. So we can say one thing. We can say that Jesus is Lord and master of my life. The question is, am I giving excuses to God, though? I can say that He's in control of all things, that He's the King of kings, that He is the Lord of lords, He who was, who is, and who shall be. I can say all those things. I can easily profess them, but do I truly possess it in my heart? And then do I truly portray it in my life? That's the question here. Because Moses is saying, "Lord, Lord," but he's not doing what God has called him to do. So far too often do we fail to remember that's the very thing that Jesus warned us about there in Matthew chapter 7. In the latter part of Matthew chapter 7, "For on that day many will say unto me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not cast out demons in your name? Did we not do many mightiest works in your name? And I will respond unto them and say, Depart from me, I never knew you, you workers of lawlessness." You say, "Lord, Lord," but you don't do what the Lord has said. Far too often, that is how we are. And the way that we are that way is through our excuses to God. Therefore, we need to begin to eliminate these excuses. Because that's what God says here. God says, "Moses, are you trying to teach me something?" He says, "Is it not I who made the mouth? Is it not I who is the creator?" And then he goes on to say, "Is it not I who has the providence over that creation?" So not only does he have the power of creation, he has the providence over that creation. To be able to make it mute, to be able to make it whatever God intended for it to be. He says, "I have the power to do this." So Moses, you're not telling me something new. Moses, I know exactly who you are. In that point, I want you to remember here today. God knows exactly who you are. He knows exactly what you are. He knows your potential and He knows your pitfalls. He knows your adequacies and He knows your inadequacies. He knows you. And yet He has called you. You see, some would like to think that because God knows this and that about me, He would therefore exclude me out of certain calls. He would therefore exclude me out of certain tasks and certain expeditions. But that's not the case. God says, "I know exactly who you are." And we can read throughout the Bible and see this coming to bear. We can look there to Psalm chapter 103 and verses 13 and 14, to where the Lord says that He has pity on us. There in verse 13, and then leading into verse 14, He says, "For the Lord knows our frame, and He remembers that we are but as dust." We can look there to Psalm chapter 139 and in verse 13. And in reality, the entirety of that psalm, I invite you to go and read. But in verse 13, it says, "For I knitted you together in your mother's womb." He says, "I know you from the very beginning." That's the same thing that He told the prophet Jeremiah as well. That He was there from the beginning. He knows your substance. He knows who you are, what you're capable of, and what you're incapable of. God knows you. Jesus would teach us this there in Matthew chapter 10 and in verse 30. "For even every hair that is on our head has been numbered." Therefore, if God even knows all the hairs that are on my head, or the lack thereof, then He also knows if I am good at speaking, or if I'm terrible at speaking. He also knows if I'm good at reading, or if I still read on a 6th grade reading level. God knows these things. But those things don't excuse me from the call that God has given to me. No, God here, notice, He simply says, "I know where you're inadequate. I know where you're not enough. I will provide for you." So that, again, it is not Moses' power that is being shown here, but rather the power of God. So take your inadequacies as a blessing. Take your inadequacies as those chips in those cracks in the clay vessels that we are, so that the more chips and the more cracks that we have, that which is within us can begin to shine through all the more brightly. So that then Christ can be able to shine through all the more. To where we can see His power and His power alone. This is what God has called us to do. But notice, Moses, he doesn't give up, does he? He doesn't say, you know what, you're right, Lord. I better go. You've given me all that I need. You have eliminated all of my excuses. God, you know what? You're right. I should go. No, instead, notice what he does. Verse 13, but he said, oh my Lord, please send someone else. Send somebody else. You see, all of these excuses right here were just fruit. But the root of it all was this right here. I don't want to do it. That's the reality of it. I don't want to do it. All of our excuses that we give as well is this right here. It all boils down to this. I don't want to do it. Now, all of us might not be as ostentatious as Moses here and literally say to the face of God, I don't want to do that, God. Perhaps some of us are. But nevertheless, this is what we find. Whenever we choose not to evangelize, it is again, I don't want to. When we choose not to teach, again, it is, I don't want to. Whenever I choose not to be a good Christian example, it's again because I don't want to. It all boils down to this right here. This is a scary thing. That whenever a man of God, whenever a person of God takes the exact opposite stance of the prophet Isaiah, as we see there in Isaiah chapter 6 and in verse 8. For Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 8, Isaiah says, here am I, send me. Moses is here saying, here am I, send somebody else. Where does this mindset come from? You see, and I struggled with this for quite some time of, well, why aren't people just excited and zealous and chomping at the bit to be able to serve God? Where do they get this mindset of, I don't want to do it, send somebody else? And I believe it's really that people begin to view the work and the call of God as a group project. Whenever I was going through high school, again, remind you, I was a terrible student in high school. Okay, that's the caveat. I loved group projects, though. And now I know you might be thinking, some of you who are smirking are thinking, oh, he loved group projects because he didn't do anything at all. He didn't contribute at all and relied on everybody else to do all the work. And I would say, you're wrong. I contributed. I put my name at the top of the paper, right? Okay? I helped out. But isn't that the case? To where in those group projects, 98, other than the 2% for my name, right? 98% of the work is done by 1 to 2 people. While the other 3, well, we're just goofing off. We're shooting rubber bands and stuff. But I think that's how the church has kind of seeped into as well. To where we just rely on others to do the work. We say the church is thriving, the church is succeeding, there's baptisms, there's this, there's that, there's that. We're doing good. And therefore we kind of excuse ourselves from the work, saying, in my inadequacy, there's somebody better to do it. Because that was my mindset within that group project. Number 1, I didn't want to do it. And then number 2, I thought they were smarter than me. So I let them do it. Brothers and sisters, God knows exactly who you are. And truly, what God has called you to do is not a communal effort in and of itself, but it is also an individual effort, for we are all to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. There's an individual aspect to this as well, and that we're all called to participate in the call. So, do what the Lord would have you to do. Because then after this, notice what it says. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. It literally means the idea that where Moses was standing was holy ground, but then it got hot. It turned from holy to hot. That he was standing on burning coals. It meant that wherever he put his feet, figuratively, it was uncomfortable. He couldn't find any solid ground anymore because God's anger was against him. Because Moses knew where he was standing was not where he should be standing, because where he should be standing is before Pharaoh at this point. He should have already answered the call of God. But because of excuse after excuse and after excuse, and then finally the truth comes out, I don't want to do it. Then God gets angry. And this is a truth I want you to get as well here from this text, because it teaches us something important. That God will be with you in your uncertainty. Where you're uncertain about who you are, your individuality, about how ill-equipped you are, about the inevitability of failure, about your inadequacy, God is with you in each and every one of those things, and He provides provision for each of those things. He's very caring, very long-suffering, very compassionate to each and every one of us in our human frailty. But you know what? He does not tolerate rejection. Because it went from resistance to now just open rejection. And believe me, there's only so many excuses you can give before you end up at rejection. There's only so much resistance that you can give until you're inevitably just rejecting it. God knows that we have fears. God knows that we have worries. God knows our frame. And God is with us in each and every one of those things. But we have to be the ones to answer the call. You see, we need to be content with where we're at, with who we are and how God is choosing to use us. I want to pull a lesson from Philippians chapter 4. If you want to turn over there for but a moment. Philippians chapter 4. Here, the Apostle Paul, he's teaching us what true contentment is here. Because each and every one of us need to be content with our person so that then we can answer the call. Because the excuses are all due to lack of contentment. All due to lack of, I don't know, I'm not enough, of inadequacy. Whenever God is telling Moses time in and time again, you are enough. You are who you are, and I'm calling you to be greater than that. So if we look here in Philippians chapter 4, we can see the provision of God being on full display here. Let's notice verse 11 right here. It says, Philippians chapter 4, verses 11 and following, it says, not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. Verse 13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. This right here is a premise for Paul that he was using with physical needs. He says, I know how to be in poverty and I know how to be in plenty. Either one, I'm content. Either one, I'm happy. Brothers and sisters, that's where I want you to be at as well within what God has given to you in ability or inability. That wherever you are, whether you're in an abundance of inability and in poverty of ability, be content. Be comfortable. Why? Because verse 13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That through Christ, I can do it all. That it does not matter if I have a little or if I have a lot. Through Christ, I can do all things. And that's what God has been trying to hound into the head of Moses time in and time again, that as long as you have me, Moses, you have enough. Brothers and sisters, as long as you have Jesus, you have enough to evangelize. As long as you have Jesus, you have enough to teach. As long as you have Jesus, you have enough to be holy. So seek after those things. Again, leave the fleeting excuses and choose faithful expedition. Go. Because that's what God called them to beforehand. Go, therefore. Just go. And then right here, right after the anger of the Lord is kindled against him, notice God doesn't give him what he wants here. God gives to him what he needs instead. He says, is not your brother Aaron the Levite coming? I know he's good at speaking. And how does the Lord know that Aaron's good at speaking? Because he also knows that Moses is terrible at speaking, right? God knows these things. We're not teaching God anything at all. And this is a principle, again, I want you to remember here, that at times when we are in our ignorance, God is still involved. Because Aaron, it says he's already on his way. That even before God had addressed Moses, perhaps, or maybe it was in the middle of this dialogue, before Moses even gave this excuse and then utterly rejected God, Aaron was already on the way. Which means God's involved even in our ignorance. So then the very last stanzas there in verse 17, he says, take hold of the staff. Take hold of that which I've already given to you and go and do the work. Because I've already provided enough for you. Christians here this morning, take hold that which God has already given to you. He has given to you His Son. He has given to you His Word. Take hold of that and go out and save people from the slavery of sin. That is what God has called us to do. No excuse will suffice. Only faithful expedition. If you are not a Christian here this morning, that first step in that expedition starts with the waters of baptism. It starts with the salvation of your soul. Because as you go up the ascending side of that baptistry, that is not the finish line, that's the starting line. The starting line to faithful and reverent service to God. If you are a Christian here this morning, you're already on that straight and narrow pathway. You are already running the race of faith. And I pray that each and every one of you might not give excuses to begin to go off to the wayside, but would stay steadfast on the plumb line that is Christ. If you have any need this morning, I pray that you would come now while we stand and we sing the invitation song.